Well, welcome back to Karl's Chronicles. Glad you could join us. We're going to talk here, or continue with our story on Theodicy. And this isn't going to be a complete, thorough examination of the topic, naturally, but I do want to be able to kind of mention some points and some things to consider. I got a few things to say on it, and then that'll be that. Where we left off gave us the idea that theodicy, looking at the justice of God, is centered around God's love, centered around the idea of free choice. It is by God giving us free choice that we have sin in the world, because when He created human beings and angels, He gave them with the potential of evil by giving them free choice. So God doesn't create evil, but He had allowed it, and there's a difference. By allowing that, it has to do with the fact that He gave us free choice in order to love Him. Give an idea here, I have a book here called Theodicy of Love. A Theodicy of Love by John Peckham. John Peckham, a very fine theologian. I had him as a teacher with an online class I was taking when he was a professor down at Southwestern Adventist University. He's now at the seminary there at Andrews. This was a book here not too long ago released, Theodicy of Love. And so it's talking about the cosmic conflict and the problem of evil, and ultimately what we're going to continue with after this little discussion of theodicy is probably then deal with some issues of the great controversy. What is the great controversy? What's going on with that? So here, the subtitle of his book is Cosmic Conflict and the Problem of Evil. Page 169. John K. Roth claims that theodicy itself is problematic and requires justifying evil. And he's rightly concerned that evil not merely be thought of instrumentally. In many ways, Peckham says, I resonate with such concerns. Whatever we say about the problems of evil, we should be careful not to trivialize it or in any way minimize the horrendous suffering that people have endured and continue to endure. And as Russell puts it, any decent religion must face the enormity of evil squarely. Indeed, one of the reasons, Peckham says, that I refuse to accept that evil is necessary for good is because, in my view, that amounts to a denial of genuine evil. At the same time, I do not think every theodicy must be problematic in the way Roth contends. This theodicy of love articulates an overarching framework in which one might make sense of God's allowance of evil broadly for the sake of love, but makes no attempt to explain every specific instance of evil, and explicitly denies that every instance of evil is, in and of itself, necessary for some greater good. Further, this theodicy does not justify any evil, but contends that it would have been better had no evil ever occurred. Neither this nor any other theodicy should still our anger, hostility, and sadness. The cosmic conflict of theodicy of love contends that God Himself abhors evil, does not desire that evil can occur, but deeply desires to eliminate evil altogether. Further, it contends that one day God will utterly eradicate evil forevermore. And in the meantime, this theodicy maintains that an enemy has done this. Matthew 13:28. It is not supposed to be this way, and will not always be this way, because the suffering of God on the cross had made a way to redeem this world while defeating and finally destroying evil forever. And so in this here context of love and theodicy is very important, I think, to explain the idea of what's behind why evil even exists. He says in his book, The Love of God, a Canonical Model by John C. Peckham, It's interesting, his whole thesis was on the love of God. Some 800 pages, his dissertation. And when I picked this up, the love of God, shortly after his dissertation came out, I'm wondering if this was just a condensed form of it. And he said, no, this was what was left over. So he had quite a lot of material dealing with this. He deals a little bit with the problem of evil and with God's love in this book too. On page 274, he says, however, much to the contrary, I believe that God's voluntary allowance, but not determination, he allowed it but he didn't determine it, of evil, actually testifies to the nature of God's love. God never desired evil, but the very allowance of evil is itself because of God's love. As explained in chapter 4, earlier in the book, he says, by definition, love must be free and cannot be unilaterally determined. Thus, it is impossible to determine that all beings freely love God because it's nonsensical to say that love is determined. This means that the necessary context for love requires the possibility that God's ideal will may be rejected, and consequently the possibility of evil. God allowed evil while passionately despising it, because to exclude its possibility would exclude love. And so this idea of God, free will and God's love are intricate. He wants a genuine relationship with you and me. And when he created us with that possibility. There were, within all his created beings who had choice, the angels and human beings, this potential of rebellion. That's the risk love takes, to be genuine. And so what we've got here in this present world is not the world that is the best that God can make, but is a world that has fallen because of man's rebellion when we join Satan in the war against God. And this problem that we have today has to do with the ongoing battle. And this is why the subject leads to the story of the great controversy theme, of not just a story about the battle that's going on and how God is going to win it, but about how God is restoring justice in an unjust world. And he had been moving in those quarters from the very beginning. In Genesis chapter 3, we see in verse 15 where he makes the promise to the woman that her seed from her will lay the death blow upon the serpent, and that he's already given them a promise in the future that this thing will be dealt with. And instead of destroying man at the time, because of the day you eat of it you shall surely die, he tells them in Genesis 2, no, he prolongs the war. He prolongs the war so in the end it'll have a positive outcome and man will win. This is the problem. This is the process and the problem that we are living with today. And so when we see God and think about God, we have to be very careful about what we are trying to make him to be when we see suffering around us. Now remember, when the innocent people suffer, there is no good reason for it. If there were, it would cease to be sin. In a world of sin, in a world that is fallen and broken, the innocent suffer. And that just shows that the kind of world that Satan had brought into being when he caused man to join him is the kind of world that God is reversing. It's why in the book of Revelation we see everything reversed. When we talk about the plagues that are falling, and the 7 last plagues, we see a sense of creation in reverse. God is on creating, bringing us back to the primordial being of what we were, as he tears everything down in order to build everything new again with the new earth and the new heaven and the new city that comes down. He's setting everything right, and that's a declaration in the first angel's message of Revelation 14. Fear God, give glory, for the hour of his judgment has come. He there is talking about the restoration of justice in an unjust world. He has stepped upon the stage of action. It's why we get to declare in the second angel's message that Babylon is fallen. Not because we want to pick on poor Babylon, But what we are acknowledging is that the old system is now collapsed, and that God's kingdom, the one coming in to replace it, is triumphing. It's triumphant and has raised up, and now is being set to be the permanent replacement of the city of darkness. So this idea that we think of God not being just, especially out of the Old Testament, compared to this New Testament God, this mercy and kind of picture that we see, is somewhat childish. And tells me that people have not really dealt with the scriptures well enough and asked the necessary questions to really deal with what's going on. They somehow think that the world we live in presently is the world God created it to be. He didn't create the world to be this way. Sin is what made the world this way. It's corrupted the creation of God. When he made the material things, at the end of each day he said it was good. But even in the minds of the Greeks developed this idea of Gnosticism. Material things were bad. Spiritual things were good. And that's not so. And this led to a concept that would affect Christianity by the late 2nd century, called Gnosticism, and where Christians begin to think in the same term. This is why Marcion, who in the 3rd century, would bring up the same kind of ideas, that the Old Testament God was somehow not the God of the New Testament, and was in fact making this physical world was what was referred to as the demiurge, is the one who created it, and that man, stuck in these physical forms, was to be released into a spirit. That was the genuine. And that's not so. God created the world to be physical. And being a physical being is not itself a sin. So we need to kind of get a better picture about what this world is, what God created was creating it to be, where we are now, what God intends to do for it in the future. These things are very important for us to consider. But instead we have all kinds of philosophies that are threatening to change the way we think about this. A very important one here is, for instance, this book I'm holding up right now. Is a book written by Albert Pike. It's Morals and Dogma. And it was basically the primer for all Freemasons in the United States. You become a Freemason, this is your Bible, so to speak. This is the book here that will direct you into their philosophy. And while they're all open to whatever God you want to believe in, they're not going to tell you which one or which not to believe. It basically leads us to a spiritual kind of journey where all religions lead to the same place. And that's Satan's idea. That's not the biblical idea. And so it's the same thing when we're looking at these different views about the God of the Old Testament, and God killing, some saying that God doesn't kill. All these things here are all coming from a corrupt point of view about what really is going on. So that's kind of give us an idea of some of the stuff that we see in the Bible. For instance, we have 5 major battles going on, 5 major mass killings that are in the Bible. They're the flood, Genesis 6-8. We have the cities on the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah, and there were other cities on the plain that were destroyed. The Egyptian firstborns that were killed. Remember when Moses was there to free the Israelites? The last plague was the plague of the firstborn. And then we have the Canaanites while under Moses and Joshua, how they were conquered in the land. And the Amalekites, annihilated by Saul. They're in 1 Samuel 15. And so to talk a little bit about these, what was going on with some of these mass killings. The first 3 examples, the flood, the cities of the plain, the Egyptian firstborn, these were done by God or by one of his own personal agents, like an angel or something. And the other 2 were by human beings, directed by God. The flood, of course, we see the judgment that was against man, and the judgment agent was the flood. The time to repent before this, as Moses was building the ark, was that 120 years. The witness to it was Noah, and eventually his family. And salvation, through faith, in this picture here, we see Noah and his family saved through the flood. So there's salvation through these judgments, and they're not just capricious. We see the Sodom and Gomorrah, the fire from heaven, there in Genesis 18. Abraham pleaded with God to preserve the city. If there were actually, and he kept bargaining down, from 30, 10, 20, 20 to 10, etc. How many people, if there's this many righteous people, would you spare the city? Yes, I will spare the city. It turns out, it says, and what's interesting, my notes have it that the salvation from the fire that fell on Sodom and Gomorrah was Lot and his family fled Sodom. Well, I don't think they fled. If you read the story, the two angels grabbed the family by the hand and led them out of the city. Almost taking them out, kicking and screaming. Not quite, but you get the picture. And that's why Lot's wife, whose heart was still back there, turned to look. And it wasn't just the fact that she turned to see something, but she turned to long for something. And this is why she turned into the pillar of salt. It wasn't just she caught a glimpse of fire coming down. She looked back. And it wasn't the looking back and the looking back to see what's happening. She was looking back to see what was lost. That's where her heart was. And so here we have in Sodom and Gomorrah, the witness, of course, was righteous Lot and his family, and Abraham. And the salvation through faith was Lot and his daughters, at least. His wife had lost her life. The Egyptian firstborn, the judgment was the angel who passed over. And the time to repent was during the previous plagues. This was the last of the 10 plagues that hit Egypt. And they had all this time beforehand that they could have repented. And so it was right up to that time, during the time when Moses was speaking with Pharaoh. The witness, of course, was Moses and Aaron. And the salvation was the Israelites were marked, where their doors were marked by the blood of the Lamb. Our Canaanites. We have an interesting thing here. This is right back at the very beginning when Abraham is being introduced to us. Back in chapter 12 of Genesis. We see a very interesting picture here. A little bit later on, in chapter 15, where we talk about God's covenant with Abram. And at the end there, he's beginning to put him to sleep. And let's see if I can find the exact verse. We're going to start with 17. Genesis 15, verse 17. And it came to pass when the sun went down and it was dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. On the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. The Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaims, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. And all right, here we go. I just missed it. Abraham, in chapter 15 of Genesis, while he's so Abram, God is making the promise to him, and as he's being put to sleep, where God passes between the parts, we read this statement here When the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. And then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And so when we talk about Israel after the 40 years in the wilderness, moving in to take the promised land from the Canaanites and the Amalekites, we need to realize that this wasn't something that was capricious. And it had to do with them filling their cup of sin and rebellion. Remember, God is the God of all people, not just Israel. And it had to do with not just their sinfulness, being sinners, because we're all sinners, but of their idolatry. And he told Abram at that time, they had not yet filled their cup. And so when we see that the judgment is Israel's army coming into the land of Canaan, we see that the time to repent was the 40 years just before they came in, because they knew they were there. They knew the story of them and that they were coming. But in the witness, of course, was the Israel itself, led by Moses, then by Joshua. Salvation, we see salvation in the story of Jericho and Rahab and family who were saved. So again, these are not capricious acts. These were not God just acting arbitrarily. And the annihilation of any sort, keep in mind, that was always within the Canaan land itself. It was never outside of Canaan. It wasn't just the way God would have you deal with your enemies. For instance, in Deuteronomy, the second reading of the law, chapter 20, we have where God gives information on governing warfare, who can not serve if you're afraid or just got married or build a house. But two things that stand out. One, Deuteronomy 20, verse 10, deals with the chance to surrender. As is, when you go near a city to fight against it, then proclaim and offer a peace to it. And it shall be that if they accept your offer of peace and open to you, then all the people who are found in it shall be placed under your tribute to you and serve you. So part of the protocol is to give them a chance to surrender. You just don't go in and annihilate. And down in verse 19 is there's the message here: when you besiege a city for a long time, while making war against it to take it, you shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them, if you can eat of them. There's all the fruit trees. Do not cut them down to use them in the siege. So the tree of the field is man's food. Only the trees which you know are not trees for food you may destroy and cut down to build siege works against the city that makes war with you until it is subdued. So this is a policy against the scorched earth. It wasn't just to go and annihilate everything. And so this isn't the typical approach. When we see here in Canaan, this is them taking over in the land of Canaan. We see here the continuation of this story with Samuel. 1 Samuel 15, where King Saul is told to go and annihilate the Amalekites. Why? Because 350 years before, right after they were there at Rephaim, they attacked the Jews. And they were able to, Israel was able to win against them at that time. This is the story where we have with Moses holds his hands up, and while his hands are up, Israel's winning. His arms get heavy, and he brings them down, and then the Amalekites begin to win. And so we have people holding his arms up for the whole battle. And here we are now, 350 years later. Saul's given the command to go wipe them out. They should have been this was a curse put upon them by God back in Exodus chapter 17, where he would make war generation after generation with the Amalekites because of what their evil was against God's people. So again, this wasn't a capricious act. This wasn't something just out of the ordinary. And the witness of this is God's nation. Now out of this we have no salvation. There's none recorded. But everything was to be destroyed, and even those little children. We know God is the giver of life, and all life is in his hands. Those children are in his hands. But he needed the tribe gone because he didn't want the young children growing up, especially the young men, who would then seek revenge against their forefathers for what had happened. They were to be annihilated. Saul didn't do the job completely. He kept many of the lambs and many of the animals and certain things that he wasn't allowed to keep. But in this case, we see that God is not as capricious as you think he might be when you really begin to look at the story. And I only touch on these things because anybody who's interested will go and do their own further study. And people who aren't interested, only wanting to promote their narrative, won't hear anything you have to say anyways. So it really doesn't matter which way or the other. But I'm just bringing these things up to tell you that there's more to it than what you see. And that when people, like I said before, begin to really criticize the God of the Old Testament as being capricious and just out killing people, it tells me they haven't read the Bible at all. And that these things are coming from a place that's entirely different. They're trying to create in their minds and hearts what God should be and why. And somehow they think that the world we live in presently is the world that it was supposed to be. But it's not. This isn't what God designed for us. He has a better plan for us. And that's what he's been working on the whole time. And when we begin to see how God operates in the present sphere, the present paradigm, we begin to understand the larger story of what's going on in the world. And that's the great controversy thing. And maybe we'll spend a little bit of time on that next time. And talk a little bit about the great controversy and what it really entails and what's really going on. But in the meantime, we realize that God is in fact love. And it's that love that's driving him to expunge sin from the cosmos. He has to deal with the sin problem in the context of free choice, free will. Because he doesn't want you to be a robot. He wants your love to be returned to him in a genuine way. Free choice. Not under threat of, oh, if you don't love me, I'm going to kill you. That kind of thing. He wants a genuine response. And that's free will. So until next time, when we talk about the great controversy theme, I hope you consider some of the things we talked about here today. And maybe might inspire you to do your own study. But again, I wasn't trying to drive you to all the technicality of everything and trying to force you into a particular position. I was just trying to speak on the larger topic to kind of get you thinking on these things and thinking about what you feel about them and how they relate to God, his character, his love for you, and how we as humans should relate to him. So until next time, thank you for stopping by.